We are told the round towers of Ireland were built by monks. Bell towers, refuges from Viking raids. Simple stone structures raised by medieval hands with basic tools and basic purpose. That is the accepted explanation. It has been repeated in textbooks, on heritage plaques, and university curricula for over a century. Then you stand at the base of one. The Kilmacduagh Tower in County Galway rises 34 meters from the ground. Its walls are tapered with mathematical precision, wider at the base, narrowing as they climb, in a ratio that modern structural engineers recognize immediately as calculated load distribution. The stones are cut and fitted without mortar in the lower sections. The doorway is positioned roughly 3 to 4 meters above ground level, accessible only by ladder. The entrance faces a specific compass direction, and the tower is built on a site that sits directly on what geologists classify as a zone of telluric current, a natural electrical charge that moves through the Earth's surface along specific pathways. None of those details appear in the standard explanation. There are over 120 of these towers in Ireland. They share consistent features across the entire island: similar height ranges, similar taper ratios, similar elevated doorways, similar site positioning. If they were simply bell towers, we would expect variation. Bell towers built by different monasteries in different centuries using different available stone would reflect local conditions, local skills, local priorities. They do not. The consistency is structural, not decorative. The official explanation accounts for the elevated doorways by suggesting they prevented easy entry during raids. That is reasonable on the surface, but the doorways are not merely high, they are oriented. Across dozens of towers, the entrance faces between north, northeast, and east. If the orientation were random, we would see a full distribution of compass directions. We do not. Someone decided which direction these openings would face. The question is whether that decision was liturgical, practical, or something the historical record does not name. The construction technique itself presents a problem that the standard narrative moves past quickly. Medieval Irish monasteries were not wealthy institutions with access to large, organized labor forces. The historical record of the same period describes communities of dozens of monks, limited resources, frequent disruption from raids, and no centralized building authority. Yet these towers required the quarrying, transport, and precise placement of thousands of stone blocks, each one fitted to maintain a continuous taper over 30+ meters of height. The scaffolding alone would have been a significant engineering project. The surveying required to maintain a consistent taper visible from the outside without deviation over that height requires either precise geometric knowledge or instrumentation that medieval monastic records do not describe. We are not told who the master builders were. We're not told where the geometric knowledge came from. The towers appear in the historical record largely already built, with construction dates assigned retrospectively based on stylistic analysis rather than documented accounts of the building process. That is worth pausing on. Not because it proves anything, but because documentation of large construction projects, even in early medieval periods, typically exists. Funding records, land grants, dedications, letters between abbots. For the Irish round towers, the construction record is thin to the point of near absence. Ireland is not isolated in this. In Ethiopia, there are towers. The stelae of Oxum are not towers in the traditional sense, but several of the standing obelisks reach comparable heights, are cut from single pieces of granite, and are carved with architectural details, false windows, false doors, beam end carvings that replicate a multi-story building in stone. The largest ones, now fallen, would have been among the heaviest single objects ever moved and erected in the ancient world. The official explanation is that the Akumite civilization developed this capability, used it during a specific period, and then stopped. The technology does not appear to have been passed down or exported. It appears, peaks, and vanishes within the historical window of a single civilization. The round towers of Ireland show a comparable pattern. The construction technique, the precision taper, the coursed stone, the elevated entrance, does not visibly evolve from simpler earlier forms in the Irish archaeological record. It does not appear to develop gradually. The earliest towers that can be tentatively dated already display the full suite of construction characteristics. That is unusual. Technologies typically show a learning curve, a development sequence, evidence of earlier, simpler attempts that were refined over time. That sequence for the round towers is largely absent. The positioning of these structures has attracted attention from researchers outside the standard historical disciplines, and the institutional response has generally been to classify those inquiries as fringe. That classification may be warranted in many cases, but the underlying observation about positioning is not inherently fringe. It is geometric. Several surveys conducted over the past 3 decades have mapped the coordinates of Irish round towers against geological surveys of the underlying bedrock. A statistically significant number of tower sites sit above or adjacent to zones where underground water systems intersect, or where specific rock strata create conditions associated with measurable electromagnetic variation at the surface. The surveys are not unanimous. The methodology has been contested, but the pattern is present enough that dismissing it entirely requires explaining why the correlation exists at all, even at reduced statistical significance. Medieval monks selecting sites for practical reasons, water access, defensible ground, visibility, could account for some of the positioning. Site selection near water sources is well documented in monastic tradition, but water proximity alone does not fully explain the specific electromagnetic conditions at many of the sites, and it does not explain why the towers were built where the monasteries were, rather than the monasteries simply expanding to include a tower wherever they already stood. In several cases, the tower predates the surrounding monastic complex in the archaeological record. The monastery may have grown around the tower, not the other way around. The internal structure of the towers reinforces this question. A bell tower functions best as a bell tower when the bell can be heard at distance, when the rope can be pulled from below, and when the sound has an unobstructed path outward. Irish round towers have small window openings at the upper levels, typically 4 of them oriented to the cardinal directions. The interior is divided by wooden floors, now gone, accessible only by internal ladders through the floor openings. There is no continuous staircase. Moving a bell into the upper section of a 30-meter tower through a sequence of ladder-accessed hatches is not impossible, but it is significantly more difficult than the alternative of simply building a tower with a staircase, which Irish builders were fully capable of doing in the same period in other contexts. The 4 upper windows, oriented cardinally north, south, east, west, are consistent with bell tower design if the goal is acoustic projection in all directions. But they are equally consistent with something functioning as a directional instrument, a receiver or transmitter of signal, or a structure whose purpose was tied to orientation rather than elevation. The official explanation does not require us to choose between these interpretations, but it also does not address the question of why the more practical design, a staircase, a wider door, ground-level entry, was not used if the purpose was simply ecclesiastical and defensive. There is a structure in Ravenna, Italy, the cylindrical mausoleum of Theodoric, built in the early 6th century. Its roof is a single piece of limestone estimated at 230 metric tons, quarried from a location across the Adriatic Sea, transported by water, and then lifted and placed as a single cap on a 10-sided structure. The engineering problem of lifting 230 metric tons in the early 6th century with rope, timber, and human labor is not unsolvable. It has been modeled and theorized, but no contemporary account of how it was done survives. The structure exists. The method does not appear in the record. This is a pattern that surfaces repeatedly when examining large stone construction across cultures and periods. The object is undeniable. The technique is inferred. The documentation is absent. For the round towers, the inference is that medieval monks built them using timber scaffolding, hand tools, and organized community labor over extended periods. That inference is plausible, but it is an inference, and it does not address the questions of geometric consistency across 120 structures, site selection patterns, or the absence of the developmental sequence that would be expected if the knowledge were locally generated. Moving further east, the picture becomes more complicated. In Georgia, the South Caucasus country, not the American state, there are medieval tower complexes in the mountainous Svaneti region. The towers are square rather than round, but they share several characteristics with the Irish examples: similar height ranges, similar taper in the walls, elevated entry points, construction from precisely fitted stone, and a historical record that describes their function primarily as defensive structures used during periods of regional conflict. The Svaneti towers were built over several centuries, beginning roughly in the 9th and 10th centuries. They are spread across a geographically isolated mountain region where large-scale organized labor would have been logistically difficult. Many are built on sites with specific geological characteristics: elevated rock formations, ridgelines, and, in several cases, positions that create line-of-sight networks between towers across the valleys. A line-of-sight network between defensive towers is consistent with signal communication, fire signals, visual relay. That is a practical military explanation. But line-of-sight networks also function as something else, a grid, a series of fixed, elevated points distributed across a landscape in a pattern that could serve purposes other than military signaling. The same ambiguity present in Ireland appears here. The towers exist, their defensive function is documented, but the specific positioning, the construction precision, and the geographic distribution suggest a level of coordinated planning that the historical record of isolated mountain communities does not fully account for. In northern Pakistan and Afghanistan, the Nuristani people constructed tall wooden towers for centuries using techniques that modern structural engineers have studied with interest. The joinery, the method of connecting large timber members without metal fasteners, demonstrates an understanding of load distribution and stress management that appears sophisticated relative to the described development context. Like the stone towers elsewhere, the technique appears without a clear documented origin and is maintained through practice rather than written instruction. What connects these structures across Ireland, Ethiopia, Georgia, and Central Asia is not a claim of shared origin or a single lost civilization. The connections are more specific and more difficult to dismiss. Similar functional forms appearing in geographically separated contexts, similar construction principles applied in similar ways, similar gaps in the documentation of how the knowledge was acquired, and similar institutional responses that classify the structures by their apparent purpose without fully addressing the technical questions their existence raises. The question is not whether the monks built the towers. They may well have. The question is where the design came from, why it was consistent, and what knowledge informed the specific choices, the taper, the orientation, the site selection, the elevated entry that appear across all of them. Several researchers working outside mainstream archaeology have proposed that some of these structures functioned as energy-related devices, receivers or accumulators of natural electromagnetic or telluric energy, potentially serving functions related to communication, power, or purposes that the modern vocabulary of historical analysis does not have standard categories for. That proposal is not accepted in academic archaeology, and the evidence for it is not conclusive. But the physical observations that motivate the proposal are real. The site positioning on geological anomalies, the specific materials and construction methods, the orientation, the internal geometry. Those observations do not require an exotic explanation to be considered anomalies worth examining. They are anomalies within the standard explanation, regardless of what alternative theory is applied to them. The Round Tower at Ardmore in County Waterford has a circumference at the base that, when divided by its height, produces a ratio closely approximating known geometric constants used in sacred and practical architecture across multiple ancient traditions. That could be coincidence. It could be the result of builders working from a shared aesthetic tradition, or it could reflect something more systematic about the design principles being applied. The institutions that manage these sites, heritage bodies, national museums, university archaeology departments, do not generally publish detailed geometric analyses of the towers in relation to known mathematical constants or geological survey data. The focus of preservation and study has been historical, cultural, and architectural in the traditional sense. The technical questions that arise from treating these structures as engineering problems first and historical artifacts second have not received equivalent institutional attention. That asymmetry in attention is itself informative when a technology from the ancient or medieval world is well understood. Roman concrete, Greek watermills, medieval cathedral buttressing, the engineering analysis receives substantial academic coverage. The methods are reconstructed, tested, taught. The knowledge is presented as a solved problem with a satisfying historical narrative. When a technology is not well understood, the acoustic properties of Stonehenge, the precision cutting of certain Egyptian stonework, the taper ratios of Irish round towers, the academic focus tends to shift to the cultural and symbolic dimensions of the object, and the engineering questions are either classified as answered by general inference or quietly left to the side. This is not necessarily deliberate. Institutions have limited resources and established research frameworks, but the effect is that certain technical questions about ancient and medieval construction remain persistently underdeveloped in the formal literature, while the cultural and historical interpretations of the same objects are well developed and widely reproduced. The gap between what we know about what these towers are and what we know about how and why they were built in this specific form is larger than the standard historical account suggests. There is one more detail that the standard explanation of Irish round towers addresses briefly and then moves past. The towers are almost universally intact, structures from the same period and region. Early medieval stone churches, monastery walls, domestic buildings survive in varying states of ruin. The towers survive, not uniformly, and not without damage, but at a rate that is statistically unusual for structures of their age in a climate as wet and seismically active as Ireland's. Several towers that were struck by lightning, a significant risk for tall, isolated stone structures in an Atlantic climate, show damage at the top but remain structurally sound below. The lightning damage itself has been noted at multiple sites without the observation receiving significant analytical attention. A tall, narrow stone structure with specific internal geometry positioned on a site with elevated ground conductivity in a climate with frequent electrical storms, struck repeatedly by lightning over 1,000 years, and remaining structurally intact. The observation doesn't require a conclusion, but it does raise a technical question that the description of these structures as simple bell towers and raid refuges does not address. What we are left with is not a mystery in the dramatic sense. It is a series of specific technical observations that do not resolve cleanly into the accepted historical framework. The towers exist, the construction precision exists, the geographic distribution and internal consistency exist, the geological positioning data exists, the orientation data exists, the gap and developmental sequence exists, the absence of construction documentation exists. What does not exist, or does not exist in sufficient detail to close the technical questions, is a clear account of who designed these structures, what knowledge informed the design choices, where that knowledge originated, and whether the function described in the historical record is the complete function or simply the function that the available documentation supports. Every object from the past carries two kinds of information: what it is and what was understood about it at the time it was made. For most historical artifacts, those two things are reasonably aligned. For these towers, across multiple cultures and multiple centuries, there is a persistent gap between the object and the explanation. The towers were built by people who knew something specific about stone, geometry, orientation, and site selection, something precise enough to produce consistent results across distances that should have prevented knowledge transfer. That knowledge was applied. The results still stand. Where the knowledge went, whether it was lost, suppressed, never recorded, or simply waiting in datasets that haven't been fully analyzed, is a question that the current historical record cannot answer. The towers remain. The method that produced them, in its full specificity, does not.